there's a tendency to go prior to whatever happened, to give the history behind this violent behavior and to actually establish a pattern of violent behavior. There's also, again, a tendency to portray the violence as being incomprehensible, not quite understandable. Even though there was a regular pattern of violent behavior, in this particular case, it was hard to understand why it happened. The provocation is not being seen, it's not being recognized as such. And else, if there is a motivation, it seems to be quite often driven by sadistic motivations. The person just wanted to hurt me, not necessarily because he or she tried to achieve something with it, but rather because there was this immediate violent response. And the effects are seen as much longer lasting. Apologies are seen as incomplete and the damage as enduring. So interestingly, it's not just that the perspectives are different, it is that these patterns and these perspectives are retold consistently in these different ways. The best understanding for why people do this is actually the need for social acceptance. The victim basically, in telling the story, asks for support. The perpetrator asks for recognition, for acceptance, for possibly even forgiveness. As Pinker in his book points out, this moralizing gap not only exists within relatively small-scale situations, you can even find this when you talk about historical examples. And he goes through a few of them. For example, the Crusades, which is told very, very different from a Western perspective, in which this is not seen as a particular great example of history, but is seen as something that happened quite spontaneously and actually also responding to a threat of communities in the Middle East. Contrast that to the story as it's being told in the Islamic world, where this is seen as a harmful act, extremely harmful act with very long-term consequences. Another example is the American Civil War, which from the North tends to be seen as a just struggle for the liberty and the end of slavery. From the South, it's quite often still portrayed as an attack from a dominant North on this particular Southern way of life. Even recognizing that slavery was wrong, it doesn't justify the violence that was used in that conflict. Briefly, to returning to some of the final ideas. Clearly, the idea of dominance is something that pertains particularly within groups. The idea of revenge also has a very clear analogy in the behavior of groups. We very often observe violence to be spontaneous and to be escalating rather quickly. So in these cases, violence and the willingness of groups to act violently seems to be less driven by possible motivations of getting a larger gain, but largely driven by motivations to protect themselves. So far, on what motivates people, what individual psychological reasons we can find for violence. Clearly, however, it's also important to think about the contrary. How do humans constrain their violent behavior?